re-establishing pluralism in the European Union. Pluralism is one of the most, I'd say, the quintessential feature of our constitutional democracies. It's a feature according to which diversity matters in a positive sense. Differences stem from our equal human dignity, and all our constitutional democracies are there to make sure that human dignity is fulfilled and flourished. European Union has been a project that has grown out of the ashes of destruction of human dignity. As we discussed today with our students, it was the object and purpose of the European Union to create, almost in a Kantian sense, perpetual peace, or at least long-lasting peace. And as far as Western Europe is considered, it's been a success. Less on the brink of old Europe, and even less here in the Balkans. But nevertheless, the European project is a project that we are not just familiar with, but a project that should be supported and the project that should be promoted in the future. A very important role in this European project, in many ways, has been played, of course, by Germany. Germany has been a country which has, before the First World War and before the Second World War, provoked a lot of problems, crises on the European continent. But after the Second World War, it has been the most important cornerstone of the post-Second World War constellation in European integration. It has been thanks to Germany, thanks to France, and then also other European member states, that the European Union has been a success, even though among the many crises of European integration that we have traveled through, and we still haven't exhausted all the crises that are standing in front of us. So without further ado, I invited His Excellency, the Ambassador of Germany, Adrian Pollmann, to present the German view, the German perspective on the history, present, and future of European integration. We could have wished for a better speaker. If anything, he's also a lawyer, and that's important for an EO class. Somebody who studied not only in Germany, but also in Italy, who has served in your professional capacity, not only in Slovenia, but also in Bosnia, in the States. Somebody who's brimming with energy, who's very open-minded, who's a very good speaker, and who's, that's the most important part, really interested into what you think. And as we agreed, Adrian is here today to engage into a discussion with you. He will have a short speech to get things going, and then we're all looking forward to the debate. Mr. Pollmann, Adrian, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's very happy to be here. Thank you, Matej, for inviting me. I'm happy to see some familiar faces. As Matej just said, I'm here to give you my view, my government view on the European Union as such. I think I want to focus on the challenges, the global challenges, and the EU's positioning towards these challenges, if we're fit and if we're up to this. I would like to keep this, as Matej said, rather short, because I'm not a huge fan of sort of fluffy presentation. I'd like to get into a discussion with you. You can ask me anything you like. I will be very frank. I'm not gonna. Usually, I'm not here to read you my talking, to be honest, because I don't think there's any purpose in doing that. I will be quite frank. We can do this in Chatham House rules, so we speak openly. And if we agree on that, I'll promise you I will get you frank and open positioning of our views on the current issues. I will make clear if something is my very personal view, but of course you're not here to get to know what I'm thinking, but I'd rather hear what my government is saying. In preparing for this for this lesson here, I thought, well, I'd rather not focus so much on the past, because I thought, you know, the historic, the legal framework of what the European Union is being built on or what it's being formed on should be quite familiar to you. I'd rather focus on the current challenges, and also particularly on how we're up to meeting them in the future. And I want to start with, and those with you who actually have, I've talked on this issue before, they know that I would always like to start with quoting my president on, since being here in Slovenia, Slovenia is considering itself sort of with such a small country. I'd like to start with a quote by my president, which should give you an idea of where this is heading. Because he often says that there are basically two different types of countries in Europe. There are small countries, and there are those countries who have not yet realized that they're small. Which means at the end of the day, no country in Europe is by itself positioned big enough, set up to be up to the challenges of today's global order, but rather as the continent as such, as the union as such, only as a union, we're in a position to address these challenges. And of course, the last crisis that we've met, starting off with the financial crisis, but obviously more recently, the corona, the pandemic, the war, Russian war on Ukraine, and most recently also, of course, the terrorist attacks and the unfolding events in the Middle East are posing great challenges to not only these very regions, but to Europe as such. And if we start off with the idea of sort of how Europe was positioning itself in the pandemic and in the Russia war, I think one lesson that we learned from it was that this, what Macron's referring to was, what is strategic autonomy? How are we positioned? Are we up to meeting the challenges that we are facing? And I'm always, when this discussion comes, what is strategic autonomy? I think it's kind of diffusing from the issue itself, because autonomy kind of has this inherent notion of it's us against others, or it's us without others, but it's not the fact. I think we should rather not call it autonomy, but actionability. Are we able to act on the challenges that we are facing? Because right now, what we're seeing over the past years has been somewhat of a return to what used to be kind of this block thinking or system rivalry emerging. Obviously with China being the one big competitor or systemic rival, if you want to put it this way, Russia being an important factor that are obviously not on that very same level. And if the recent war or the current war in Ukraine showed us something, and particularly on the political sphere, is that we as Europeans, I guess, have to acknowledge the fact that we sometimes tend to overestimate our influence. If you allow me, I would like to quote the Economist at the very beginning of the war, analyzed 199 states on their relations to Russia, and only 52 of those have clearly stated they were supporting on what you would consider sort of our stance, our clear stance, the West stands on the Ukraine war. That would equal roughly 15% of the world population. 12 were Russians. But 127 of those states did not clearly position themselves. And that, I think, is teaching us the lesson that we have to, as a European Union, reposition ourselves, and particularly our approach towards the emerging countries that are so-called the global south. I don't like the phrase, we can talk about this, but what maybe used to be referred to in the early years as a non-aligned movement. So there is a large group of countries that is not clearly identifying it with either of these two systemic rivals, if you want to put it sort of oversimplified. There's this famous quote by the Indian foreign minister. He said, Europe has to say goodbye to the idea that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but that the world's problems aren't Europe's problems. And there's a lot of truth to that. If you let it sink in a little bit, it changes our perspective, and it has to. And we can see that also in the way that these countries, let's refer to them again as the global south, as a group, which is more diverse than this term may indicate, that they're also seeing it that way. You know, we have to kind of get rid of this Eurocentric view of global challenges and crises and look at it in a broader context. If you look at the countries that I was referring to, or the non-aligned countries, if you like to call them, 25 of those, the most powerful of those, they represent 18% of the world's GDP, which is more than the European Union's. That gives you an idea of what we're dealing with in terms of global challenges. Also, like that, also relativizes, I think, our relative weight, economic weight, political weight in dealing with these countries. So, what we usually experience, particularly the older ones among us, what sort of was the decade of Western hegemony, if you like, I think is coming to an end somewhat, or it's becoming more diffuse. It's becoming less clear. And the same is true if you look from Europe's perspective, also when it comes to allies. If the recent events, or until 3 years ago, in the United States have taught us something, then that even the United States is no longer, not necessarily unconditionally, the ally that we thought it could be. At least it could change. And we're looking ahead of the elections next year, which might again get us back into realizing that, you know, Europe has to do a better job taking care of itself, positioning itself, and relying less on others. Which leads us to realizing that we need to be able to act swiftly, strategically, and more decisively. And the question is, how do we get to do that? As of now, I would argue that often enough, and way too often, the European Union has been kind of like the smallest common denominator. Because of course, with all 27 member states, particularly when it comes to foreign policy, agreeing on an overall foreign policy approach, as you all know, as we're all seeing, even now with the Gaza crisis or in other contexts, has not been an easy thing to do. We have member states that disagreed on, or prevented even a European position on, say, Hong Kong, the Middle East, or other issues. If you look at Ukraine, even there, the support at the beginning was quite unanimous. It kind of dwindled a little bit, and we're now seeing also developments in other countries that used to be first supported on Ukraine, that might have already indicated they might change position. So up until now, often enough, way too often, what we agreed was kind of like the basic, the bare minimum, as obviously unanimity demanded that. So the question is, are we fit for the challenges of the future? I'm not necessarily only referring to the political, the immediate crisis challenges, but rather also sort of what I'll consider to be the biggest challenges for our countries or the Union as such, in terms of the lack of skilled labor, how do we deal with AI, what do we do with the climate? So all of these factors that are not immediate crisis, the climate crisis, you can argue, is very much an immediate crisis, but you know what I mean. It's not something that gets at you every day, like the war in Ukraine or like the events in the Middle East now. While at the same time, while addressing these challenges, how are we able to preserve the open societies that we are so proud of, that we're so rightly proud of? So how do you deal with these things? How do you, for example, if you take AI, how do you address the risks of AI? How do you limit maybe also the influence of AI, while at the same time preventing an open society and the basis for what makes our democracies still, I would argue, the best systems that there is? How do we ensure plurality of opinions while fighting disinformation? So how do you strike the balance between that? How much do you allow in open speech? Of course, you would argue a lot. Well, at the same time, we've seen that sort of an endless amount of information and disinformation can very much harm the democratic discourse that we're having every day in our society. So how do you strike these balances? And those are questions that only open societies can answer themselves. Autocratic obviously don't. How do we embark on new technologies while at the same time mitigating its risk? That is actually referring to AI as well. How do we open up our countries to the necessary legal immigration that we need in terms of skilled labor, while at the same time ensuring a functioning common asylum system? So how do we get the union fit for what's tomorrow? And there, of course, we need to before we start even, while we're looking into even enlarging the union, we have to look inside. So how do we work on the functioning, the mechanisms? An ever larger union will not be, in our view, my government view, and in some other countries' views as well, Slovenia being one of them, will not be in a position, will not be in a way functioning enough. We continue to focus on unanimity, for example. That's why we advocate for qualified majority voting, at least in some instances. How do we get this union functioning, moving forward, without losing what we already have? And I think that is the biggest challenge for us as a union. We sometimes, tend to, particularly in Germany, we tend to look at things very negatively. I think we can still, there's a lot to be shown for, a lot to be proud of, not that we've achieved, but it will need a lot of effort to defend that, particularly as the countries that we're dealing with, and that, let me sort of finishing by that, because I think it's an important point. The countries that have now started to, rightly so, and overduly ask for a different footing in order for us to deal with them, particularly in the African countries, for example, they will no longer be willing, again, rightly so, of us telling them what to do. So we need to put ourselves into sort of our foreign policy on a new set of level, if you like, in order to forge these new alliances that we will need to tackle these challenges. If we look at the Russian war, if you look at what happened in in Hungary, we were still able to secure the majority of votes, but this is not a given. So we need to do internally. We have to arrive at a point where we become more coherent and more actionable, while at the same time we need to be cognizant of the fact that the union, as it is right now, is not yet fit to competing on a global stage, I would argue at least, with the sort of the internal failures that it has, that is inherent in the system. If we're not fixing that, we will not be able to deal on a global scale with the challenges that we're facing. Those are the theses that I'm putting out here, and I want to leave it as such, just crisp and short, and I'm open for any kind of question you have. You can be quite